Okay, let's talk about the complex of globalization, which is a problem which almost everybody is facing too
Indeed.
nowadays, including United States, including Europe, where we can see the increasing inequality, increasing gap between poor and rich. So, what's your observation about what's going on in Southeast Asia, what's going on in Malaysia? Have you noticed a similar phenomenon?
Well, globalization has brought about unprecedented creation of wealth for a large part of the developing world. I think nowadays, unfortunately, this large creation of wealth is not equally shared among the various classes, economic or socio-economic classes in societies in various developing countries. Yes, you will see jobs being created, but often they are, shall we say, low paying jobs. People would, of course, be able to lift themselves out of poverty, but not much more than that. They will still live at the margin of poverty. This you can see very clearly in many Southeast Asian countries, whereby even though the country as a whole would grow tremendously in terms of the GDP increments and so on. Unfortunately, you still see a lot of people living at the verge of poverty. And that is something I think that all of us will have to address.
Yeah, the problem is not only the gap between poor and rich itself. The point is about increasing gap between poor and rich, which we noticed over the course of last decades. So, which might go back to in my wording, automation, tech revolution. Now AI is on the way, big data is on the way, and also go back to the globalization itself and including market economy.
But there's a traditional notion of exploitation by the rich of the poor. I think that is certainly still a very important aspect of this problem of the growing gap between the rich and poor. But in addition, of course, when you see this so-called fourth generation of industrial revolution, huge automation and so on, you would also see at the same time a lot of job losses. People would need to so-called reskill themselves. But of course, just like education, very often only a very small fraction of people will be able to transform themselves or reskill themselves or re-educate themselves in order to grab the new, or shall we say, more technology-oriented types of jobs. Most other people, however, would lose their jobs and thereby their source of income.
Yeah, exactly. That's something would concern me very much. Normally the re-education, as you pointed out before, or the training is normally much more slower, like much more behind the trend itself, which caused jobless first. So, which caused to a large extent, some emotional sentiment like anti-globalization, populism, which has been spreading out all over the world, which might cause Donald Trump, Donald Trump to take over the office, which might cause the Brexit to happen. So, my question is, where's the solution?
Well, people are looking, in a sense, for various scapegoats. Some would resort to nationalism, trying to say their own country or their own race is the greatest in the world. Some would resort to so-called xenophobia, for example, looking down and excluding the foreigners. But I still think very importantly is still education. And number one, education in mathematics and science, a renewed emphasis on technical education, a renewed emphasis to make sure people, for example, nowadays know how to program a computer even from a very young age. And also, on the other hand, I think nowadays, because of the technology, the advancement in technology, you will see a lot of people sort of shunning themselves away from day-to-day interactions with other people. So some sort of communication skills will also be needed. So this combination of technical skills and communication skills, I think, are very important for us to move forward.
Yeah, which actually also requires a lot from the government.
That's
or
right.
From even intergovernmental coordination. Yeah, which should be a mechanism. Yeah.
Yeah, I think there are various countries. Some countries are doing better than others in terms of technical education. I think for example, Germany, that is usually the example which people around the world would sort of use. So the German example, how could it be replicated more readily around the world to groom people, not only the hardcore scientists, but also technicians. Technicians who will be able to service this sort of new machines, this sort of new technology, so that people can make a living out of it. I think is very important.
Yeah, you mentioned Germany before. Yeah, I will give you the warning not to speak too highly of Germany because now we know there's also a widespread populism in Germany. And also, a few months ago there was a cover story published in Spiegel magazine, which is called in German, "Nach Angela Merkel ist Finsternis." After Angela Merkel is darkness, because Angela Merkel is planning to step down by 2021. So, which means basically in 2 years, all which we can expect in Germany to happen is all darkness. So what I'm seeing is this political disappointment caused by globalization, caused by automation, caused by all this interaction, is mostly a lot faster than what we trying to achieve, which is re-education, retraining. So again, we need some political solution to settle the problem before everything is getting escalated.
But on the one hand, of course, you have this sort of rapid advancement in terms of automation in the fourth generation of industrial revolution. On the other hand, in various countries, they have various cultural backgrounds, right? I think people could also spend more time in terms of how do they, for example, if they are talking about, let's say, the nationalistic pride, right? That means they must have a lot of culture behind them. So how to make sure this sort of culture can be presented in a more modern and readily acceptable manner. For example, I think it's something very important. Nowadays, there are also people concerned with the preservation of environment. People are concerned about climate change. So, for example, I would see even in some Southeast Asian countries, they have these great cultural traditions, very colorful weavings of cloths and so on. But for example, instead of just using the normal cotton, could you use, for example, some of those plastic waste or plastic garbage to weave into some of those, for example, ornaments, for example, various chains, various decorative items? That is also something, if you don't like the more technical side of things, you could also go into, and it also helps you propagate your culture, which you're so proud of.
So now we have different cases, different models. In various of countries, we have United States, we have Britain, we have Europe, we have China. Almost every country is facing to the similar or even the same problem, as we pointed out. So if you try to travel around the world, where do you see in this country this way of doing could be a good solution? In this country is something which is bad, for example. Because let me name an example. A few years ago, even a few decades ago, we always thought about what's happening in Europe and the United States is a good example for the rest of the world, and for the rest of the world, even not to mention developing country, we need to follow, we need to learn from these Western countries. But now we see even the United States is doing very hard, in catch up. Even Europe is doing very hard to stop the populism caused by all this globalization. And again, to some extent, China is proud enough to say, we are able to provide with some sort of solution. We have the Chinese solution, China's model, which actually why Western is slowly declining, Eastern. So I was talking with Kishore, yesterday. He pointed out Eastern is inclining, is rising, while Western is declining. This is definitely a trend, which we are seeing, but I'm not sure 100% whether this 100% makes sense. So we are just at the turning point to see what is good, what is not good, what is wrong.
Well, what I see is this sort of advancement in technology, which we discussed just now, is empowering a lot of people around the world. I just read earlier today of some very entrepreneurial, shall we say, educational businessmen in Kenya. They run this sort of camps whereby they are helping people, even in Western countries, to write their school essays, their school compositions, and so on. They're making a lot of money out of it. So your teacher gives you an assignment, you ask these Kenyan helpers to write you a very good essay, and you can get full grade and full marks, right? So and all these are made possible because we have the internet, for example, we have rapid telecommunications. So I think, how do we make use of this sort of rapid advancement in technology in empowering our local community? I think that is something which we should place more emphasis. There are various advantages in the various models we learn over the years, the European model, the China model, and so on. But ultimately, I think each country, each region, they will have to find a model which suits them best. For example, I mentioned just now this sort of using the plastic waste, for example, to design into various decorative items, right? You need to sell those items. You should make use of online platforms, for example, to sell around the world, and not just selling to your neighbor, right? Because your neighbor is not very much richer than you. So how do we, in a sense, educate our population to make use of this technology, to broaden their views, to broaden their business prospects? I think that is really important.
Okay, last but not least, which is actually a huge question, geopolitical conflict between China and the United States, between rising superpower and the existing superpower. We talked about many years ago. And over the course of last year, I have to say things are not getting better. Instead of that, things are getting worse. When we were talking about in our program a few years ago, there wasn't yet trade war, but now we have the trade war, which is being escalated. Generally speaking, are you optimistic about what's going on? In terms of what's going on between China and the United States?
Well, I think as long as Mr. Trump remains the U.S. president, I think this trade war would probably go on for quite a while. Because he is somebody who places a lot of importance in terms of businesses and trade, or I should say anything which has to do with money, right? But of course, if you look at a president like this, he seems to be very reluctant when it comes to going for real or hot wars. So you will see this kind of skirmishes, this kind of sort of confrontation in terms of the financial aspects, the trade aspects going on for a very long time. And now it's, of course, we see most seriously between US and China, but we should also pay attention to, actually there is also for example, mini trade wars going on between US, even with the European allies, even with Japan and so on. And very soon, I think it will be extended to Southeast Asia.
I might be too pessimistic in saying, all this which you mentioned before reminds me to what happened in the second half of 19th century, decades before when the first World War began. That was the first wave of globalization, where always the interest among the powers are interconnected with each other, so that people were not able to settle their conflict, and they have the tariff war in 1980s. Then more than 20 years later, there's the First World War, which is the outcome, the first outcome of the first wave of globalization. So, am I too pessimistic?
Well, I think nowadays we have something else. a lot of these superpowers, they have nuclear warheads and so on. So if they were to go to war, it would imply the possible use of nuclear weapons. I think that hopefully should hold them back a little bit, because the usage of nuclear war is of course what we call mutually assured destruction. It's not as if it's not even like prohibited by law. It's like I destroy you and you will destroy me. Yeah? So in that kind of circumstances, I think these leaders would perhaps think twice before launching a real war. Yeah.
If we try to look at or try to predict about what's going on, about the scenario between China and the United States, let's say by 2050. So what kind of scenario can you imagine between China and the United States? Is it going to be interaction between two peaceful big powers? Or is it going to be a conflict in sense of hot war or cold war?
Yeah. I grew up during the Cold War period of this confrontation between the Soviet Union and the United States. I would tend to imagine in the future the US-China situation would evolve into similar kind of confrontation without actually going into a lot of hot wars. So it will be some sort of Cold War, but perhaps minus that kind of, shall we say, proxy wars during the Cold Wars, like Vietnam, in Central America, and so on. Yeah.
So talking about a proxy war, so are you going to take proxy for China or for United States? Where's the position of your guys in this so-called Cold War? I mean, we were talking about this many times, right?
Well, Southeast Asia traditionally, as we all know, they are inclined to lean towards the U.S. in terms of defense and strategic matters, but because the United States, in terms of shall we say, financial interactions, now in these years are not as strong as before. So of course they will still look for China for trading opportunities. But when it comes to a war, for example, when it comes to war, that means all hell will break loose, right? So these Southeast Asian countries, I think they will have to really make a choice. And I think a lot of these traditional allies of the U.S. Would have to side with the U.S. because if they don't, then they are the enemies of the U.S. And whether we like it or not, the United States is still the most powerful nations in terms of their weapons and various military capabilities.
Is there any role where you guys, for example in Malaysia or particularly in Singapore, can try to play in a sense of coordination between these two big enemies?
We, as you could see over the past few years, countries like Singapore, Vietnam, Malaysia, and so on, we have all played host to various peace summits and conferences. We will continue to do so because even though we are not Switzerland, but we are trading countries.
Right.
You will see the leaders of Malaysia or Singapore saying very similar things, namely South China Sea should be a sea of peace because otherwise we cannot do business. They will say very bluntly, right? So, but if really there has to be a war, then they probably will have to pick side, and they will have to side with their traditional ally.
You mentioned South China Sea, so which made me very interested. You know, in the last 2.5 years, it looks like South China Sea has been calming down.
Yeah.
I don't know why. Maybe people became all of a sudden reasonable. Maybe due to Donald Trump phenomenon. I don't know.
I think for Donald Trump, he continues with the so-called freedom of navigation operations or foreign ops. But he is not like his predecessors who are really going out there to try to pick a military fight.
I have the answer. Yeah. He is more or less a business president.
That's right.
He's been focusing more on trading itself.
That's right.
But don't forget, you know, around this time, or maybe two months around this time, the next year is going to be a re-election. If he will be re-elected, or somewhere else will be re-elected, for example, my assumption or my feeling is, the strategic conflict between China and the United States in narrow sense,
Yeah.
it could be South China Sea, could be Taiwan Strait, it could be even East China Sea, will be still escalating. Again, I might be too pessimistic, because that's really the structural, strategic problem between China and the United States.
In terms of the U.S. Election cycle coming up again, I think the focus of possible conflict is not quite U.S. and China. When we talk about military conflict, is rather with Iran. I think some sort of action vis-a-vis Iran is distinctly possible, but not China.
Not China and the United States.
I mean, not China and the United States militarily. I think militarily with Iran is distinctly possible. Yeah.
Will South China Sea again be a hot spot, hot topic?
Well, the South China Sea is as a focus of strategic attention, it goes up and down over the years. So I'm not surprised that it would heat up again next year, for example. If any party would take actions which other parties would not feel happy about.
Okay, in this sense, thank you very much.
Thank you.